Now, Betty Morris, who is a very thorough researcher, went to Special Archives, which is in London, in Reading actually, not far away from London, where the British have monitored every transaction and every broadcast that was in the air in those days, ever since 1936. And he found no proof to any such message coming in the radio. There was no television. Coming in the air, and I found no evidence for anything in writing. And in fact, we know now for sure there was no such call. There was an Israeli propaganda myth to say that the Arab leaders called upon the population to leave. And they wanted to develop this myth because they wanted to hide the fact that they have decided in March 1948 to expel the indigenous population of Palestine. Now we're talking here about 900,000 people who lived for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, mostly in villages, in 11 towns. And when the war ends, 500 villages are destroyed, 11 towns are gone, 750,000, maybe 800,000 out of 900,000 become refugees. Their land, they own most of the land in Palestine. Their land is being confiscated by the Jewish state. They have no property rights anymore, no land rights. Their houses were looted, and their careers were stopped. And it was a real human tragedy on a large scale, And the main responsibility, according to my historical research, lies with those people who decided to expel them, the Zionist leadership. So that's point number 2.
Now, who are these people? Give them names.
Yeah, I'll give them names. First and foremost, we have David Ben-Gurion, who was the chairman of the executive committee of the Jewish Agency and later the first prime minister of Israel. A very powerful man. Most of the crucial decisions have to go through him. If he had been against it, this decision would not have been carried out. But he had people who supported him. Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan. Very young generals. We're talking about the early 20s. Generals in their early 20s. But very eager to ethnically cleanse Palestine. Israel Galili, Eliezer Kaplan, who was a kind of a finance minister. And Mr. Transfer himself, as they called him Mr. Transfer, was someone called Yosef Weitz, who was responsible for the development and settlement section in the Jewish Agency. His duty before the war was to look at the Arab territories and say which is the fertile land and which part of the Jewish Agency will take the land and so on. He had transfer committees, official committees which dealt in each region with how to execute the transfer and what to do after the transfer. If they can cause people to flee, that's the best. If they have to put people on trucks and transfer them, that's all right. If they have to massacre people in order to intimidate them into flight, that's okay as well. I realized that, contrary to the Israeli official historiography, that there was only one massacre in Deir Yassin. I realized that there were dozens of massacres. I once remarked that even a peace-loving movement like the Quakers, had they been in such a similar situation, would have admitted to more than one massacre. It's so ridiculous that the Israelis thought that they can sort of be let off with their own official history by saying, yes, of course, one massacre did take place, which is ridiculous. I should say something about this ethnic cleansing operation. I wrote about it for the first time in 1988, 1989, and I'm rewriting now a new book about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine because I realized how little do we still know about it, the planning, the execution, and so on. Because when I started my work as an historian, I thought the whole historical truth lies within the documents, the archives, the written sort of documentation. But then I realized the people who leave behind them documented evidence are the expellers only, those who were the victorious party. They have archives, they have documents. Those who have expelled don't have documents, don't have an archive. What they have is a collective memory. and you have to talk to these people before they die. And I started talking, and I'm now involved in a huge oral history project, very much like the Israeli government, and I'm glad they did it. We're involved in a huge oral history project about what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. And through that project, I realized how little we know about what actually happened in each village, and how exactly the command from above to cleanse Palestine became a reality on the ground. It wanted an Israel free from as many Palestinians as possible, and having as much territory of Palestine as possible. The third point, which is no less important, I think, than the other two, which contradicts the official historiography, the official narrative, is the whole story about the peace efforts after the 48 war. The Israeli official historiography is that the Israeli leaders, stretched their hand and waited for the Arab side to, to take the opportunity and conclude a peace treaty with Israel after the war of 1948. My own research found that actually it was the Arab side and the Palestinian side after 1948 that was willing to reach a compromise with Israel, according to United Nations guidelines, which were very simple: divide the land into two states, allow the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, and you have to remember that most of the homes were still there in 48, and internationalize the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, the American administration at the time, President Truman's administration at the time, supported the Arab and Palestinian position, and even for a very short while exerted heavy pressure on Israel to accept what the Americans deemed at the time as a very sensible solution. And the Israelis refused to conclude a peace treaty under those terms. And then there was an election year in America, a different American administration, different American policy, and the opportunity for peace was missed, mainly because of the Israeli intransigence and extreme policies. So if I sort of lump together the 3 points of 1948, just to clarify it once more, I would say that the first myth, or the first point, has to do with the myth of Israel being on the eve of another Holocaust in 1948, because that would justify everything else Israel would do afterwards, in the war itself and after the war. Israel was not. And in fact, there was a chance for finding a different kind of a solution to the conflict in Palestine. But it was very useful for the Israeli government and later on for the Israeli cultural systems to produce this myth of Israel being on the eve of destruction. The second is that 48 war did produce the Palestinian refugee problem, not because the Palestinian refugees fled voluntarily from Palestine, but because they were ethnically cleansed from Palestine. And the third point was that there was a chance for peace after 1948, and not because the Palestinian and the Arab side were the inflexible and refused to enter such peace negotiations, but on the contrary, because the Israelis were very happy with the results of the war, and they didn't see any need to go into negotiations which might change their or harm the achievements they had gained during the war. So that was the major revelations about 48. And I have to say and repeat it was not only my work. It's the work of that group called the New Historians. We're not that many, 3 or 4 Israeli historians who were working at the time, at the same time, on the same archives, reaching the same conclusions or portraying the same picture about the past.
How does the Israeli public or anybody deal with what you're suggesting?
Yeah. It was a long process of reaction, which has its ups and downs, and I will try and describe it, because we came to the public arena, if you want, or into the public consciousness in the late 1980s. So let me just describe it sort of chronologically, because it hasn't ended yet, and I don't think there is a bottom line saying this is how the public received us. The first reaction was very suspicious, and it came through the articles in the printed press, in the electronic press, and there was an attempt to just push us aside by saying these are not professional historians, they work according to their ideologies, and they are at best ignorant and at worst agents of the PLO. But this passed because the global reaction was very different. In very respectful and respected academic centers, our books were accepted, our works were regarded as solid professional works of history. So the academic and political establishment in Israel had to review its position. And roughly, I would say, around the beginning of the Oslo process, September 1993, the attitude changed for better. In the sense that more people than before in the media, in the academia, in the educational system, not so much in the political system though, started accepting at least part of what we were saying. Maybe not the whole picture, maybe not every interpretation we gave to the facts about 1948, but the skeleton of the story, and the knowledge that we were deceived as Israelis for many years. This was very clear, and a heated debate started in the electronic media, in the printed media. It was quite public, and it's a small country. Now the debate reached its peak or was still at the highest level of public attention as long as the peace process continued, because it was very relevant to the peace process. In fact, at one point there was a huge public debate between what can be called the old historians, that is, the historians who produced the old narrative, and the new historians in Tel Aviv University, which brought more than 700 people into the debate, which in Israel, which is a small country, is a huge number of people that would bother in the evening to, instead of watching television, whatever, go and hear an historical debate. And that was a very lively debate, and I think it really, many people even who didn't agree with us, agreed that we did something very positive to the Israeli academia and to the Israeli research. Now, Benny Morris, who is a very thorough researcher, went to Special Archives, which is in London, in Reading actually, not far away from London, where the British have monitored every transaction and every broadcast that was in the air in those days, ever since 1936. And he found no proof to any such message coming in the radio. There was no television. Coming in the air, and I found no evidence for anything in writing. And in fact, we know now for sure there was no such call. There was an Israeli propaganda myth to say that the Arab leaders called upon the population to leave. And they wanted to develop this myth because they wanted to hide the fact that they have decided in March 1948 to expel the indigenous population of Palestine. Now we're talking here about 900,000 people who lived for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, mostly in villages, in 11 towns. And when the war ends, 500 villages are destroyed, 11 towns are gone, 750,000, maybe 800,000 out of 900,000 become refugees. Their land, they own most of the land in Palestine. Their land is being confiscated by the Jewish state. They have no property rights anymore.